Hi everyone, welcome to King's and welcome to this evening's event. This is part of the Arts and Humanities Festival at King's. The theme this year is Underground. And today we'll be talking about invisible languages, so languages that are not visible on the surface of global discourse or media discourse, or not as much as other languages. So I'd like to welcome our speakers today, and I'm going to introduce them to you. Sorry, maybe I could. So I'm going to introduce them to you in a second. So what I'd like to do this evening is try and discuss some of the, so I'd like this to be as much as possible an open discussion. So there will be some short presentations from each of us, and then we'll open up to questions from you. Can everybody hear? Yes. Yeah. So the theme is invisible languages, minor languages in general, and the status of small languages in a kind of global world of languages, which is dominated by 3 or 4 major languages. So what does it mean to write, to speak, to think, to communicate in a small language today? And so we'll be hearing, we'll be talking about more general issues around minor languages, but we'll also be discussing one case in particular, which is that of Friulian, which is a minority language spoken in the northeast of Italy, and that will be our kind of case study for today. I wanted to start with some facts around languages in the world. So how many languages are there? People think there are about 7,000 languages in the world. It's a recent estimate. But 90% of them are spoken by less than 100,000 people. So 90% of all the languages in the world are small languages, minority languages. And on the other hand, less than, 150 to 2,000 languages, so less than 3%, 1.5 to 3% of all languages that have been recorded are spoken by more than 1 million people. So a very small percentage of the variety of languages that are out there. It's also true that we now, the number of languages keeps growing in the sense that we now consider as a language, more and more idioms, more and more variants, more and more varieties of speech and discourse. So compared to 100 years ago, the number of languages, as you can see, has increased from 1,000, as recorded in the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1911. We now think there are over 6,000 languages. So on the one hand, the number of languages is increasing. On the other hand, though, it's rapidly, perhaps worryingly, diminishing. And there's a recent estimate from UNESCO said that if the current trend continues, by the end of this century, half of the languages, half of the world languages will be extinct. So by will we be saying 2,100 or 2,100? At the end of this century, we'll have half as many languages. So yes, just to give you a sense of what kind of numbers we're speaking about. What kind of numbers we're speaking about when we sorry, I'm not used to speaking on a mic. So what kind of numbers are involved? Okay. So when we say that a language is big or small, global or minor, what do we mean? So yes, that's a list of the world's most widely spoken languages, and that's based on the number of native speakers of that language. And you can see that the order of magnitude is pretty staggering. And Chinese Mandarin, it's spoken by over 1,000 million people, and the second language on the list is significantly inferior in terms of, the figure is much smaller, just less than 500,000. So global languages. How about life expectancy of languages? We talk about endangered languages, so languages that are in danger of disappearing. The definition that UNESCO gives of an endangered language is that when its speakers cease to use it in fewer and fewer domains, use fewer of its registered and speaking styles, so when the language becomes less rich somehow, or stop passing it on to the next generation. So when the passage onto the next generation is interrupted. And Friulian is in the UNESCO's list of endangered languages at the moment, despite a recent revival, fueled also by supported also by the regional government, who invested a lot in trying to revive Friulian in its various areas of use. Then I wanted to sort of try and give some definition of what do we talk about when we talk about a minority language. People use different terms: minor language, small language, lesser used or lesser known language, or dialect. So what is the official definition of minority language? If you look at the kind of piece of European, I know it's not very popular at the moment, good old EU, they have Charter for Regional Minority Languages, which defines minority language pretty much in terms of its legal status within a nation state. So the language used is that of, legislation and citizenship. So that's something perhaps also to think about and that we might discuss. What's the link between language identity and also political representation. Just some data there. So considering Europe and taking as a reference the official definition given there of minority language, there are 60, the European language considers around 60 languages to be minority languages, and these are protected by the Charter. And it's estimated that around 55 million people in Europe speak as their first or second language a minority language. So that's quite a lot of us, I guess. So that's interesting. And this is the fact perhaps not widely known. Within Western Europe, Italy is the country that has the most recognized minority languages. So 12, including Friulian. Yes. So just a little bit more about, that's a map of the languages of Europe. You can see it partially overlaps with the boundaries of the various states and countries, partially, but not perfectly. And Friuli is this bit here. So the bits in the sort of darker green, oops, sorry, here. That's the area where Friulian is spoken. How many here speak Friulian? Yeah. Excellent. How many of you live in Friuli? And the rest of you, you live here in London?
Do you speak Friulian?
Would you like to speak Friulian now, today? I'm sure people will be interested in hearing at least what it sounds like. Okay, so what is Friulian? It's a minority language spoken by the higher estimate. This varies depending on whether you consider full kind of active knowledge or passive knowledge of the language, and whether you want to count in Friulian speakers outside of Friuli or not. But the highest estimate is 600,000 speakers. And it's a Romance language, and linguists classify it as belonging to a family of Rheto Romance languages. It's not spoken only in Friuli. Friuli experienced intense out-migration, especially in the last. In the late 19th century, and really up to 1960, the late 1960s. So there are as many Friulians in Friuli as outside of it. Some of them have taken their language with them, and there are now communities of Friulanophones, I guess, in South America, in Canada and Australia, and in London as well, perhaps. And yes, so Friulian has a pretty ancient written tradition. So early texts date back to as it says here, around 1150. The earlier texts are ballads. The most famous one is Mio bello Dumlo, Bello Dumlo di Amor. And there's a couple that have survived and are studied for their literary value, but also for their value as documents, as early documents that tell us something about the origins of this language. It has a status. It's protected by regional and state law since 1999. So it has acquired, after long, I guess, struggle, it has acquired the status of a full status of a language, and it's taught in schools as an optional subject since 2007. And recently, and well, yes, and higher education as well. And recently, sorry, flashed you. And in 2011, a 6-volume dictionary of the Friulian language was published, and it has the peculiarity of using as meta-language not Italian but Friulian. So the definitions of words are given in Friulian and not in Italian, which is a bit of a, I guess it's unusual, and it's an attempt to reverse the power dynamic between the major language, in this case Italian, and the minor language that becomes really the protagonist of the dictionary. Just to what why would we say that a language is invisible? In what sense can a language be visible or invisible? People talk about, at least I know that people talk about Friulian as the sort of rhetoric has also been that Friulian is the language of the heart, is the mother tongue, la Marilenge, as it's often kind of affectionately called. So it has its dimension is a private one. The family and the sort of group of friends, the community, the local world of the town and the village. But does it matter for a language to have a public presence as well and to be visible outside of the community of speakers, and how can that be achieved? So again, just some data to think about. We now know that half of the internet is in English, and the second most popular language on the internet is Russian, but it only accounts for 6% of of online content. So it's an overwhelming sort of hegemony of English there. Another issue is that of translation. What gets translated into English, therefore accessing a much wider, we might say, yes, global readership. So what gets translated? Only 3% of books published in the US are works in translation. The other 97% is work originally written in English. So there's very little influx of translations from other languages into English. We don't have data. Maybe I'm all has some. I don't know. We don't have data about the UK. So the 3% up there. That relates to the U.S. market of translation. But a recent survey among publishers working in the UK and in other English-speaking countries found that 80% of publishers believe that there is a market for translation that has not been tapped. So people working in the industry feel like there could be more translations being published in English. So why are some languages invisible? And should we care? Should we do something about that? Are minor languages, endangered languages, more likely to be invisible? Would that, if they become more visible, would that make a difference? So just some questions to kind of start with. And yes, so I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Emma Cleve. She runs the Writers in Translation program at English Pen. And in this role, she administers grant programs for UK publishers and organizes literary events to celebrate and draw attention to great writing from around the world. So her work is quite crucial to the kind of processes we're starting to think about. And Emma in particular is at the moment working at redeveloping the Pen Samples grant scheme, which is designed to encourage and support the translation and publication of literature from non-mainstream. That's a nice way of putting it. Non-mainstream European and minority languages. So if someone out there wanting to having read a great book in a minor language, wanting to translate it, just talk to Emma about that. So
yeah,
over to you.
Thanks very much. I'm a bit small, so I don't know if... Is that okay? Can you hear me? Yeah. So I just wondered how many people here have actually heard of English Pen, just Anyone? I know you have. Okay, so I was working on the assumption that not many of you would, so I'm going to give a bit of background about the organisation to start off with, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the work of the Writers in Translation programme, and I'll touch on this report and some of the other kind of interesting things that we're working on and trying to improve when it comes to non-mainstream European languages and minority languages. So English Pen has been campaigning for the freedom to read and the freedom to write for 90 years now. So it's actually one of the oldest human rights organisations in the world. It was founded by a poet and novelist, Amy Dawson Scott, in 1921. And her vision was one of an international network of writers who would show solidarity across borders. We've grown into a global human rights body now. There are 145 pen centres, I think, at the most recent count, in over 100 countries. So it's a really big network of writers. So we were originally established as a group for poets, essayists, and novelists, which is hence the pen. That's where we came from. But now we've expanded to include translators, editors, bloggers, as well as readers, of course, and friends of English Pen. So we're a member organisation. So if you are interested at all in joining English Pen or finding out more information, I've got a few leaflets, not many. I didn't expect quite so many people, but I've got, information here and a few bookmarks if anyone's interested. So very quickly, I'll just give you an idea of what we do as an organisation. So we have 5 main strands of work. We provide moral support and create a space for literature and free expression for persecuted writers around the world. We campaign against any unjust UK laws that affect free expression. So we've recently been campaigning for libel law in the UK. We also aim to lift barriers to reading and writing for marginalised groups in the UK. So we work with refugees and migrants, we work with prisoners. We're now also working with returning soldiers, and we work with disadvantaged young people as well. So we run creative writing workshops with those groups. And we also obviously aim to diversify UK literary scene by enabling work in translation, which is obviously, I'll be talking more about that. And we have a series of prizes where we aim to celebrate outstanding literature through those. So the translation programme specifically has now been running for about 10 years. It's, we've supported over 100 books now in translation from a wide range of languages, and I'll go into a bit more detail into which languages are more common languages that we support through the programme. It was founded in 2004, the programme, by a group of translators, surprisingly, publishers and agents who saw that there was a real need for books in translation to actually be promoted rather than just published and then ignored and just sort of essentially falling off the bookshelves because there is no sort of promotion behind those books. And we obviously publish a lot in the UK as it is. So the programme was established, and then a few years later, quite a few years later, in 2012, we had a funding increase, so we were able to boost the work of the programme. So we went from very, very modest small grants programme to actually having a budget of £140,000 sponsored by both Bloomberg and the Arts Council England. So we're able to really encourage much more writing in translation with our programme. I'll give you an idea of the structure of the programme. So we have 3 main grant schemes for translation. We have a programme for promoting literature and translation, and the main criteria for that is human rights themed books. So we're really looking, that's what's one of the main criteria for that programme. We're also looking for obviously great books in translation, and a jury of experts judge those applications from publishers. We have a translation programme Pen Translates, which is more recently established and sponsored by the Arts Council England. And our main criteria there is literary diversity, so it also speaks to this event tonight. So the panel will actively be looking at the range of applications, and they'll be trying to select a very balanced portfolio, so making sure that there is a mix of languages. Obviously, we can only respond to what is submitted. But they're very aware of that, and they're also keen to get a balance of male and female authors, because we have found over the years that publishers submitting a lot more male authors. I don't have a figure for you, but it's a significant, I think it's probably around 80% male authors, which is really quite high. Very briefly, our 3rd grant scheme is the Pen Samples scheme, and that's what I'll be talking a little bit more about just in a few minutes. so we reserve this specifically for minority or lesser translated languages, but it's a very, very small scheme. It's kind of the poor sister of our other 2 grant schemes, so that's something I'm working on at the moment to develop. Whew. Sorry, I won't be going on too much longer. I just wanted to mention that we do have 2 active websites, the Pen Atlas, so we publish literary dispatches from around the world every Thursday on the Pen Atlas. That's available through our website, englishpen.org. We also have a new site which promotes translators alongside authors in equal right, called the World Bookshelf, and that's a new site. So we're very proud of that. And we also work regularly on International Translation Day and the Literary Translation Centre at the London Book Fair. These are 2 events where we aim to raise the profile of literature and translation, so we're really working together with a great team of partners, including the British Centre for Literary Translation, Literature Across Frontiers and Words Without Borders, amongst others, to make sure that we're creating a really lively programme of events for translators, publishers, anyone who wants to come and visit and discuss languages and why they're important, basically. So, bringing it back to the discussion today, I wanted to focus on our work aiming to promote the diverse range of literature and translation. So, we have. I wanted to kind of make the point that we're trying to do quite a difficult thing, really, because we're promoting translated literature in a very oversaturated market, and I'm talking about the Anglophone books market, which obviously has been mentioned. There was an article, I think came out this week by Publishing Perspectives, posted by them, that stated that in 2013 the number of books published in English hit 28 million. So that is a huge, huge number of books, obviously. Just to bring the 3% figure slightly more up to date, still there, yeah. We, Literature Across Frontiers, have actually been working on further research to actually work out what is this figure, how many books are published in English translation, and they've got it up to 4.5%. This is based on data from 2008, so it's still much more work and research needs to be done, but they are actively working on that, as far as I'm aware. So they're worth checking out if you haven't. So just putting it into context, it's even more of a battle to be promoting minority languages or non-mainstream European languages, as we're effectively talking about a niche within a niche. It's one thing to be promoting translated literature, but another thing to be promoting smaller languages within that. It's a difficult thing to do. I just wanted to, I can actually physically show you these reports that we worked on back in 2010 and 11. So this is the report that has been quoted from this evening, and this was a follow-up report which contains think pieces and essays from key stakeholders within the industry about where we're at. Yeah, we can circulate. I didn't have enough copies to bring, but they are all online through englishpen.org on our Scribd account. So, that way. Sorry. So the reports. So the first report, the smaller, flying off the shelves. We wanted to look into the assumption that there's an assumption that there's this chain of events that occurs within publishing, and that everyone kind of blames the next party. And so the translators obviously want to translate books, but the publishers don't want to publish them, so they can't get anywhere. And then you go to the publishers, and the publishers say, well, of course we want to publish works in translation, but there is, we can't give them to the booksellers because nobody wants to buy them. And the bookseller says, well, of course, there is a demand for translated literature, but we can't stock them because the readers, etc. And the chain goes on and on. But actually, what we found with it, obviously, this was a very small-scale study. I think there were only 152 survey responses amongst a group of academics, translators, booksellers, publishers. But the overwhelming response was that everyone wanted to publish more in translation, to read more in translation, to translate more. And so with that positivity, we've been kind of using that since to kind of build more programs and support for an infrastructure for translated literature. So what is the issue? I think obviously financial question. When it comes to translating a book, it's a huge cost for a publisher, and so that is obviously a big thing. But there are a lot of independent houses popping up now, and they are aiming to work around this issue, and they're creating different models of publishing. So, And Other Stories, they're a very small press, but they have created a subscription model, signing up people who will read their books in translation, so they can cover their costs. And there are many others popping up all the time and trying to find a way around these huge costs. There are also obviously grants. So the PEN, we have our 3 main translation grant schemes, and also funding from the European Commission as well is available. I'm coming to the end, so I just wanted to bring it back to our aims and what we want to do to kind of address this issue of there being kind of not access to translated literature being not readily available. So we have this smaller scheme, and even though we do have our PEN Promotes and PEN Translates, which I've mentioned, so our bigger funding schemes for publishers, we have this smaller scheme which is open to agents and translators and people that are generally passionate about literature and translation, but they're more focusing on smaller languages, minority languages. So we specifically reserve funding for readers' reports and a professional sample translation, which can be given to a publisher. It's our smallest scheme, but we see it has the most potential. And it has the most, if we can be supporting books at this stage, before they've even entered the market, then hopefully we can create more demand for those books. So to give you an idea of the languages that we've currently been supporting, it's predominantly French, Spanish, German, and Arabic. Those are we've supported over 100 books, and I would say we've supported 20 different languages, but those are the 4 that kind of recur. The majority, so that kind of reflects, I would say, the publishing industry in general. It's the European languages that are mostly published, and one of the issues we find at PEN is that is not reflective at all of the multilingual society that we live in, and so that is one of our aims, is to overcome that. We hope to develop this scheme and to give underrepresented languages a chance at publication in the UK. And we're concerned about this growing disparity between the increasingly multilingual and multicultural society and the amount of literature available in translation. There's a huge, huge difference in that. It's obviously very important to us at PEN, and we see access to literature from around the world very, very much as a free speech issue. So until there is access to literature from around the world, including all languages, then we will continue to pursue this work and hopefully develop the programme in the next few years. So I'm going to stop there. And obviously, if you have any questions about the work that we're doing, you can either get in touch with me after the event or ask questions, and we're finished. Thank you for listening. Hope I gave you enough information.
Yes, perhaps we'll be taking questions at the end. What do you think? Or do you want questions now? Maybe after Federico and Angela have spoken as well. So thanks Emma. Who knows, maybe there's some aspiring authors or translators in the public wanting to take advantage of the grants. Maybe some Friulian authors. Yes, so our next speaker, Federico Fallopa. He's lecturer and he's program director for Italian studies at Reading. Reading has an old tradition of Italian studies. The department there was founded by Italian writer Luigi Meneghello and continues to flourish and to do great work on Italian culture and Italian literature there. So his research is on ethnic stereotyping in particular, and linguistic construction of otherness. And his most recent books have been, I'll just say the Italian title, Sbiancare un etiope, La pelle cangiante di un topo antico, and Razzisti a parole per tacere dei fatti. So books that have to do with, yes, as he says, as I just said, ethnic stereotyping, especially in the context of colonial and post-colonial Italy. And he's graciously agreed to talk a bit about the book that we've recently published, edited by me, on the Friulian language. And Federico's going to talk about it.
Thank you very much, Rosa, for inviting me. Thank you all for being here tonight with us. I think it's a great opportunity to talk about not just the book, but many issues related to minority languages and language policy and other topics related to this one. My starting point is going to be the book by Rosa, edited by Rosa. It's an important book, I have to say. I enjoyed it. And I try to give you some reasons why you should read it, or you should try to read it. not just because maybe you are interested in the Friulian language, but also because you are interested maybe in the history of the language, and again, the relation between history and so diachronic and synchronic aspects of a language. It's a very, I like the contributions that have been published in the book, because it's not just, these are not just linguistics, so we are not just talking about linguistics, but there's also historical context, or contextualization, and also a more, sort of, they open up a little bit the debate, the discussion about the literature produced and written in Friulian. So it's not just talking about the language in itself, but also the, what has been done in this language, in this minority language. And I come back to, the terminology, because it's very important to me. So just briefly, about the book. The introduction by Rosa is interesting, and there's already a challenging point there, if I may, Rosa. When you talk about the terminology, you say, I'm using minority language, dialect. These have been fluctuating a little bit, in the discussion. Well, this is a very important point, I have to say. Not just for the Italian context, in which we have, a very long tradition about, language versus dialect, or Italiano versus dialects. So there's a very complex topic in the Italian history. But also, if we want to translate these, terms or terminology into other European languages, I mean, that can be a problem there. Because we got a charter in 1992, the European Charter, about minority languages. We have minority languages. So they're not talking about dialects. They're not talking about, they are not using other terms or expressions. I mean, they're very clear about minority language and what a minority language should be according to that charter. If we have to pay great attention to the terminology, especially, I think, in the Italian context. Because, and then I come back to this point, we got a law, a national law in 1999, so the 482 in 1999 that is implementing the European Charter, and from that point, 99, we have 12 minority languages protected in the country. But I go back to that because the definition is very, very important, because if you change the definition, you may include or exclude minority languages within that category. The example, and I go back to this, is the language spoken by Roma people, the Romani. That hasn't been included in the Italian law 1999 because, according to the law, the criteria to give a definition of minority language were territorial continuity and historical continuity. Right, we can talk about historical continuity. So the Friulian, language may have a historical continuity. In this case, we also have a territorial continuity. But what about a language spoken by nomadic people that hasn't a territorial continuity? That's a very important point. And that was a political point in 1999, where two major political parties, Italian parties, right-wing parties, Alleanza Nazionale and Forza Italia, voted against, they threatened, the government say, we are not voting this law for, this bill, we are not passing this bill, if you want to include the gypsies, the Romani language. So either you exclude them, or we don't vote. So, and that was a point, a problem of definition. So they had to reinvent the definition to redefine what a minority language was at that point. The European Charter says minority languages shall have territorial continuity and historical continuity. Well, wait a moment, because, according to this definition, we may exclude minority languages that are very important, not just in the Italian national context, but also, in Europe, right? So this is a major point. Terminology may mean including or excluding languages within this category. And by excluding languages, you exclude these people from the allocation of resources. And that's another political point. So I stop there, but we can talk about this, yeah? Just to problematize a little bit, the terminological issue. But I go back to the book. So that was very important to talk about the Friulian language within this, wider context. The historical one, and I appreciate that because, when we talk about the history of a language, normally we think either of an internal history of the language, so let's say the natural evolution of a language, the so-called grammatica storica, so historical grammars of a language, or the external history of the language, so the social linguistic aspects or context. In this case, you try to do something in between. I think it was a very useful and complex, project, because you try to combine the internal and external history of the language, or the Friulian language. And I think this has been a wise option, a wise choice by you. You try to combine the diachronic description of the language, Paolo Beninca's chapter, with the historical contextualization of the language within not just the region, the Friuli, Venezia Giulia, but also in other places in which the language has been spoken and is still spoken, so outside Friuli. You try to contextualize this within a literary debate discussion, not just talking about one of the major Italian authors, Pier Paolo Pasolini, that wrote in Friulian, but also wrote many things about Friuli, and I don't want to, simplify your discussion about Il sogno di una cosa, but also by talking about the new poetry written in Friulian. That's another point to problematize, in my opinion, because poetry may be also oral, not just written. We are looking for a written tradition for minority languages and dialects. That's fine. That's another criterion in order to give a definition of a dialect or a minority language. Does it have a literary tradition, historically? Great. We do have minority languages and dialects with an oral tradition that is so strong and so, important that must be considered. So it's not just the written tradition that matters, but also the oral one. And again, my example is still, the Gypsies, the Romani language in Italy. We do have a great oral literary tradition of this culture, of these people in Italy. But again, this doesn't, meet the criteria established by other people, either in Europe, but also in the national government, the Italian national government. Well, the literary tradition must be only written. Why? Why? That's another point to problematize, in my opinion. Then the legal aspects are very important. There's a very interesting chapter talking about the legislation about minority languages, in particular about the Friulian. So we know that the Regione Friuli Venezia Giulia was one of the first in Italy that tried to sort of, not implement, but try to protect, the language. That started in the 80s. 81, if I'm not wrong. Then in 96, we have a law, a regional law, and then we have the 99 national law, and again, implemented by the regional government. That's a very interesting point, not just to look at the legislation, different steps in the legislation. That's very important. Also because you can see also the change of the political context. But these should go together with a sort of different analysis. All right, we got the legislation, but what about the resources allocated to enable, these projects or these, law, to work? Because if we just have the legislation, and this happens in many places in Italy, among those 12 minority languages, we do have Friuli Venezia Giulia that has put money, has given money to protect the language. But we have other places, the Croatian or the Albanian, for instance, the Arbarish in southern Italy. Where's the money? We have the legislation. We have right. On paper, this language is protected. But in reality, what? If we don't have any resource to allocate to the language. So, in my opinion, the legal discussion, or the discussion about the legislation should go together with the discussion about the resources allocated in order to, implement the legislation. And that's another aspect that should be considered when we talk about minority languages, not just about minority languages, but also about language policies in general, right? On paper, fantastic, great. We protect them, but what about the reality if we don't allocate anything to these languages? And then going on, the lexicon, the chapter about the lexicon is fascinating again by Carla Marcato, an expert in dialectology, in Italian dialects and minority languages. And again, we have diachronic and synchronic aspects that, go together, like the lexical stratification. That's very interesting, paragraph, or subchapter of the chapter. We do have, for instance, a discussion by Carla Marcato, in which we have at one side the Friulian and on the other side either the Venetian or the Italian. So the relation between the Friulian as a minority or a language spoken in Friuli and other languages, not just the Italian one. And I go to another major point. If we talk about multilingualism, we don't talk about bilingualism or just the relation between two varieties. We talk about one language and many varieties or many other languages aside. So Friulian, that's fine, and Italian, but it's very recent. If we go back in time, we have to consider also the Venetian dialect. That was the prestigious variety in that part of Italy. So the diglossia, the combination, the relation between two varieties, one more prestigious and the other one less prestigious, according to the functions of the variety, was between Friulian and Venetian, not between Friulian and Italian. So that's very important. Let's look also at the historical situation, not just between Friulian or a minority language and the national context, but in particular in Italy, between Friulian, the minority language, the dialect, and all the sort of, combination that you can have, the complexity of the situation. Ascoli, the famous dialectologist, linguistician, of the second half of the 19th century, already said that. It's not just a matter of a national prestigious variety and local less prestigious varieties. We've got such a mix, such a complexity in Italy. That's why Italy should be polycentric, not just monocentric. Yeah? So, again, the historical kinds of analysis, in this case, works very well, because we got a bigger picture and also a more defined picture of the situation, especially for the Italian context. So I'm very happy that I found that in your book. And then I don't have much time, sorry, I don't want to run out of time, but then we got chapters about migration. So as I said, not just the Friulian spoken in Friuli, but also outside Friuli. And again, according to the studies made also on the...
If I can step in just... This is an image of the canopy of Westminster Cathedral here in London, and that was made by Friulian craftsmen who came. Yeah. Often they were mosaic and terrazzo workers. This is a particular craft that was practiced in Friuli, and you have other examples in the lobby of the National Portrait Gallery, and in the V&A, all the flooring has been done by Friulian craftsmen, and also in some tube stations, although most of them are now closed, are no longer in use. But those were also covered in mosaic, and that was often the work of Friulian craftsmen. So just a curiosity.
That was a wonderful chapter. It's still, it's a wonderful chapter because I didn't know that. We had trade unions, for. Yes. For Friulian workers in London, for instance. That's interesting, again, both from a linguistic and a social linguistic, point of view. Because we know that one of the ways in which the Italian language, for instance, spread out was, the political discussions and also the, unions between the 60s and 70s of the 20th century. So that's interesting, to give people, to empower people from a political point of view, means also to give them the chance to, of course, to improve their communication and also to get a more specific kind of lexicon to talk about social issues, not just about their own everyday life. That's interesting. And this is quite new, by the way, because we got something about Italian and also Italian outside Italy. We don't have much about minority languages outside Italy. So I'm very glad that I found, again, this chapter in your book. Very new also in the Italian debate context. And to end with, you know, we can then talking about the literary context, and so Pasolini, you know, one side, and then the new poetry, I already said, and then it's your topic. Just to, in order to conclude a little bit, let me just say something more as sort of conclusion about, you know, minority languages, legislation, all these aspects I try to touch upon. It's very interesting because, you know, sometimes we think that we need to protect languages by law. That's a question for you and for me. Do we? Shall we protect languages by law? I mean, as a linguistician, I would say no. I mean, language is a sort of organism that evolves, changes all the time. So if it dies, I mean, it's like a human body, you know? But there's a problem here, at least two problems. One is that if we think about minority languages, normally we think about the Italian context or the European context. And we think about communities, generally speaking, that are already protected. But if we think about the figures you gave us, Rosa, so all those languages spoken in the world, that's another problem there, because this is not just a matter of, you know, threatening languages. It's a matter of threatening real people, environment, you know, environmental, you know, we've got an environmental issue there. Because if you think about Asia, Africa, this means that these languages die because their environment died. This dies, you know. Otherwise, you know, we got an example, a wonderful example for the Italian, you know, history, you know, in the Italian history. Matteo Bartoli was a linguistician at the University of Torino, beginning of the 20th century. He went to Istria, so the peninsula, you know, a Croatian peninsula that was called Istria at the time. And he wanted to, Dalmatia, sorry, a bit of confusion, Dalmatia. And he wanted to record the last speaker of Dalmatian, of that language, spoken in there. And he did it. There was one single speaker of Dalmatian, and he had the chance to interview him. Then the speaker died, and the Dalmatian language died. Right. This is a matter of, I mean, of a normal evolution of the language. Do we have the speakers? Fantastic. So the language survives. We don't have the speakers anymore because we think that the language is not prestigious anymore because we know we've got a natural change in language. All right, great. I mean, that's a choice by the speakers community. That's a choice. But if, you know, language dying out, you know, disappearing means people and environments and cultures disappearing, there's another matter. There's another problem. And in the European context, even if we've got a charter that's been implemented by national governments in the, you know, in the last 20 years, fantastic. But normally we talk about real people that go their own life, they use their own minority language in their everyday life. I mean, they're not really threatened by the national variety. In other places, in other countries of the world, this is a problem of survival. I mean, people surviving, cultures surviving. So yes, we should allocate resources there in order not just to protect the language, but to protect the places in which these people live. Because in our countries, Friuli is a wealthy place. You know, you got radios for the Friulian language.
We were on the radio the other day.
Yeah,
Angela and I.
So even if you don't have,
on the Furlan.
Even if we don't have the resources or as much as we wanted, we still have the people, you know, the culture. I mean, we still have a sort of identity that protects the language in itself. When these identities disappear because, you know, there's a model that changes, disappears, there's a problem there. There's a problem there. I don't want to be too political, but, you know, neoliberalism also, you know, means this, you know, disappearing of, you know, cultures and languages. And just to conclude, so to go to get to the new ethno-linguistic minorities, because there's another interesting point. We're talking about a so-called historical ethno-linguistic or linguistic. Oh, so I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh my God, it's already late. Just all right. Okay. We late.
No.
Oh, just okay. Give me 2 minutes and I finish. New ethno-linguistic minorities. So that's a problem there because we talk about the historical ones, so the 12 that, you know, Rosa has mentioned, but we got new language or linguistic minorities in Italy for, you know, used by people that come to Italy migrate to Italy, and use other languages. Now, there's a political implication there, not just a linguistic one. What shall we do? And again, it's a matter of allocating resources, because we thought, for a long time, all right, the only problem is that these people are looking for integration in the national culture and context, so maybe they want to switch from the L1, their own language, and again, we were quite ignorant about the situation 30 years ago, because we thought a national language. No, we got people that speak already 3 or 4 languages in their own country. So multilingual in their own country, not monolingual, as many Italian people are. So from L1 to L2 Italian, right? So we studied those, steps, from L1 to L2. Then we said, oh, well, we got a new generations. What do we do? What shall we do? They're already, Italian native speaker, mostly. They are in contact with local dialects. They want to maybe learn their, parents', languages. What shall we do? And there's a problem there, because this is not just an educational problem. It's not just a matter of education, the Minister of Education. We should work with the communities. We got projects also in this country, mainly in this country. Bilingualism Matters, for instance, in Reading is a new project. Working with the communities, because a lot of times, if you talk to parents, they think, oh my God, bilingualism, being bilingual or multilingual is a disadvantage. We want them to be integrated, to be perfectly English or perfectly Italian. Yeah, but let's see what these people want really to do or to learn or to keep, So it's not just school. We need to go and see what happens in reality in social networks. So rather than starting from L1 to L2, it would be better to study these networks. And think about this. Each one here in this room has got a sort of multilingual network in her life, everyday life. I speak, my sloppy English now when I talk to you. I speak my Italian when I talk to my Italian colleagues. I may speak to my Genovese when I speak to my dad, because he's from Liguria. So mixing up my varieties every day, all the time, every day. This is already a network in itself. So new studies working on these topics say that it's much better to follow these people in real networks than just taking, the school, the family, society, peer groups. Well, but these are not isolated words or isolated contexts. We have to think about a connection among these different contexts and to see what is the real switching, from one variety or one registers to the other, according to the different contexts and to the different people you interact in your everyday life. So I wanted to problematize. I hope I could give you some elements, something to think about. And sorry about the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks. Just, to connect Federico's intervention with Angela's. So you talked about a word disappearing when a language disappears, and Pasolini, whom Angela is going to speak about, that was also one of his concerns, I guess, the disappearance of this peasant world that he found in Friuli and that he admired and loved in it also through the studying and writing in Friulian. So I want to introduce Angela Felice. She's director of the Centro Studi per Paolo Pasolini of Casarsa, Udine. Casarsa Pordenone. Casarsa della Delizia Pordenone. I don't know why I said Udine. So that's the research center based at Pasolini's family home in Casarsa. She's also the artistic director of the Teatro Club Udine, and she is a theater critic for several newspapers. Among her publications are Introduzione ad Annunzio, which came out in 1991, and Il Teatro Friulano, she co-edited with Paolo Patui, and a series of edited volumes on Pasolini including Pasolini e la televisione, Pasolini e il teatro, and a forthcoming volume which is kind of very related to what she will be talking about, Pasolini e la poesia dialettale. So over to Angela.
I begin.
Do.
Allora, come mi ves stimolat a taca a fevela par furlan. Così anche italiani e inglesi e sentiranno il sonoro dal furlan. Understood anything? This is, sorry for my English, is a basic level for my English. And in fact, I read what I want to tell you. Thank you for Rosa, and thank you for the King's College for this invitation. I met Rosa this last summer in Casarsa. And so, in that occasion, Rosa told me, why don't you want to come in London to speak about, of course, I said, and here I am. So, my Friulian, you have heard these sounds, is different from the Friulian used by Pasolini in his poetry. Italy is very complex, not only for languages and dialects, but also, have you heard now, also for language, because every dialect, the language of a little region like Friuli, inside has too many different pronunciations. For instance, my Friulian has palatali. What is the translation?
Palatal consonants.
The word house in my Friulian sound is chiase. Do you hear chiase? The word ends in e. Pasolini Friulian variant is ciasa. Cha, not palatale, but a little Venetian sound, and the word ends a. It's a different sound inside the same language. Why Pasolini chooses to write in Friulian? Because that variant in Casarsa, we have heard before, were never written before him. It was an original sound, an ancient sound without literary mediations. No? My Friulian, instead, had in the centuries a little literature, not an important literature, not Shakespeare, but it has already a mediation in page written, and so it's not important for Pasolini. He used that Friulian, no? Understood? Now, I read now. As an introduction to Pasolini's Friulian poetry, you know, in all the world, Pasolini is known as a filmmaker, I hope, I think also in the United Kingdom. A little parenthesis, come say, little pause. In the translation of movies by Pasolini, you listen English, I think. But also in movies, Pasolini in the Italian version, Pasolini doesn't use Italian, but dialects in his films. The Cameron, no, inspired by the Cameron Boccaccio, is not Florentine dialect, but by Naples. because Napoletan is a popular sound. Racconti di Canterbury Tales is not Italian, but a dialect of North Italy, Bergamo. Yeah. In the translation, all this music of dialects, of Italian dialects, of course, in the translation are lost. No, it's different also this comparison between choices in Pasolini movies and the translation in other languages. Close the digression. So, as an introduction to Pasolini Friulian poetry and to his point of view about dialects or little languages in Italy, I want to begin now with his words that I beg Rosa to translate with me, a little piece. There are words of a poet, of course. I refer to a page which Pasolini wrote in 1952, when he was far from Friuli and we already lived in Rome. He writes, do you help me? Chi parte in treno o in auto da Venezia e si spinge su verso il retroterra veneto, giunge in Friuli senza che se ne accorga.
Okay. Some people here don't speak Italian, so so I'll translate. Okay, so whoever leaves by train or by car from Venice and travels north towards the Venetian mainland comes to Friuli without even realizing it.
The first phrase. Solo se ha una grande pratica di quei luoghi potrà distinguere il colore diverso dell'aria e dei campi.
So only if he's quite used to, or if he's been there before, will he realize that the air has a different color. The different color of air and fields and the... Oh no, sorry, you haven't read that bit.
He says that is the same landscape.
Yeah, there's no interruption of continuity from Veneto into going into Friuli. That's the kind of meaning of the...
But, I arrived to this point, l'unica diversità vera nei confronti del Veneto è la lingua.
Yeah, but the only true difference between Veneto and Friuli is the language.
Practically, he says Veneto and Friuli are in the same landscape, no? The same color of the air, the same atmosphere, but the difference is the language. So it makes a relationship between geography and the sound of that geography. But which geography? A little area, peripheral area, out of center, and therefore other, different, unmistakable. This is the center of thought in Pasolini, no? The love and the attention for little things, not big things. Little languages and not big things. Adesso faccio una sintesi, ma è così. So, in this relationship between a little area out of great history and its language, you can see that in Pasolini poem, poet, the attention is not to the Friulian language, is not a linguistic matter, or not only a linguistic matter, but is related also to an anthropological point of view, that besides is full of sentimental reasons, and more in the years of intellectual consciousness. You know Pasolini's life in Friuli, no? Conoscono? Do you know?
Angela's asking whether you're aware of Pasolini's relationship to Friuli. Do you know that he was...
Also in Italy, Pasolini, people know Pasolini lives in Rome, of course, no? But in Friuli he founded all the points of view of life, because Casarsa was the village of his mother, and he lived in Friuli during the Second World War for 7 years. And so he formed there the typical characteristic of his thought. And so he chose, as I mentioned before, to write in Friulian poetry, but not only poetry. Rosa, can you show this page and explain what it is? Spieghi cos'è.
Oh, okay. So Angela's asking me to explain what this is. So this is a journal that Pasolini published between 1945 and 47. It's entirely in Friulian. It includes bits of poetical sketches, short stories, and sort of various different kind of texts, political texts as well, by that group of people you see in the picture. And his
pupils.
Yes, his pupils. During the war, he'd set up a school for local children to attend, as schools had been closed, and he collected their translations, attempts at translating Italian and foreign poetry into Friulian, his own early works, and works of friends. And there's 5 or 6 of these journals he called Stroligut, so kind of
that is a little newspaper, Stroligut.
Yes.
So in 1942 he published the first book of his production, whose title is Poesie a Casarsa, 13 little poems. But you must pay attention that some of those poems were written in the first time in Italian, and in a second time he chose to translate them in dialect. A choice just definite, but also provocative. 1942, in fact, against fascism. Because you know, in Italian history, fascism opposed with strength Italian dialects. And his choice was against his father also, because Pasolini's father was a soldier, an official, an officer, an authoritative man, authoritative man with fascistic ideas. So in Pasolini, the choice of Friulian language is a complex of reasons. It's also provocative, also against the fascism, and also against his father. But this choice was not exceptional in 1942. He continued to use it also in many other further directions. In Stroligut, 5 newspapers. This is a print, recent print, like the original print. And in 1949, they published a second book of poetry in Friulan language, whose title is Dov'è la mia patria? That is, Where is my country? An interesting book whose poems are written in many different little shades of sound, Friulian sound, according to the various variants in the little villages around Casarsa. For instance, in a little village named Bannia, they use the th like in English. Th, è vero? Is a little village. I think the inhabitants of Bannia are
Fluent in English.
200 persons. Only in this little village, also today, they use th. Per dire falce, Pasolini, falce, il martello, in this, Dov'è la mia patria, they use false. So in this Dov'è la mia patria, or is my country, Pasolini make a linguistic workshop in relationship with the new wave of his poetry, which in this book is not more lyrical like in the first one, but epical, narrative, and open to social subjects like emigration, the tragedy of war, the poor's condition, and so on. In Pasolini poetry in Friulian language, we have two sides, so two aspects: lyrical, narcissism, the poems with I, with a strong I that himself, and epical, lyrical and epical, that we can find, I bring with me, in the organization of the complete Pasolini's poetry in Friulan language, La Meglio Gioventù, you know this book? The translation, La Meglio Gioventù, is
the flower of youth.
The better youth. But it's not correct Italian, La Meglio Gioventù. In Italian, La Migliore Gioventù. But this is a chorus of a soldier of the big war, the First World War, degli Alpini, La Meglio Gioventù. So, in this book, he organized all his production in Friulian language in two parts: lyrical, Poesia Casarsa, and epical in the second part, like a summary, like a leaf of himself. I've outlined a little history of the poetry in Pasolini, that now in Italy, in these last years, are more and more studied. And many professors, like Guido Santato, for instance, in Padua, a great professor in Pasolini poetry, consider that Pasolini's poetry in Friulian is the best in all poetry, also in Italian, not in dialect, for instance. I go to speak about Pasolini poetry in Friuli, also in Italy, in Naples. I went in these years, in Calabria, in Agrigento, a Lecce, in the south. They call me, for the language, of course, in order explaining this experience, unknown, but more and more studied. So in this history in Pasolini, are concerned many reasons, also beyond private reasons or sentimental causes related to his mother, for instance. The first one is, for me, Friulan language, just because never written before him, and therefore pure, absolute, original, is for Pasolini the most suitable for poetry, for an absolute poetry, according to a romantic aesthetics indestructibly good. There is Pasolini opens the first writing in his newspaper in Friulano with the words of Shelley. Shelley.
Yeah,
No?
a quote from Shelley, from the English
Shelley,
poet
yes.
Shelley.
So, and the poet for Pasolini, for the young Pasolini, must search the truth, the reality, also the mystery, the reality, and the effort of a poet in that language, peripheric language. The effort must have that direction. The first reason. The second one, the fact of writing, of transferring sound in graphic work, allows the consciousness of the speaker, of the popular speakers, for Pasolini, gives them and their language dignity and pride, and possibility of knowledge of their ancient tradition that before was unknown and out of the official history. But the fact of writing is useful also for the community. For Pasolini, Casarsa is a polis, like in the ancient Greece. And the third one, the third aspect of Pasolini's works with dialect is this: all those results are possible if there is a poet. Like him, for instance, a poet a little bit inside in a language and a little bit outside of that language. And so we decide far from a total immersion in a popular world, a little inside in the popular, but a little bit not with the popular world. And so in Destroy Good, the first writing that opened all this newspaper is very interesting because the title is Dialect, Lenga e Stil.
Going around, yes.
Dialect, Lenga e Stil. The translation is dialect, language and style. Pasolini describes in Friulian language the different levels, in his opinion, between dialect, language and style. Dialect, for him, is the pure speaking, learned in family, from mothers and used in daily life. This is dialect for him. But a dialect becomes a language if it's used by a poet. Every poet with its personal style. A poet who is able to give expression to the collective sensibility and tradition, like Dante in Italian. The dialect in Florence was a dialect, but Dante grows and make it, no, come si dice, fece crescere.
Makes it into a language.
Yes. This is the position, the opinion also in Pasolini. And so, a dialect, when becomes a language thanks to a poet's work, and therefore it leaves every vernacular aspect can be also translated. Not literary, because Pasolini thinks that it's impossible to translate poetry, and also dialect, but in its inner meaning and mind and soul. For Pasolini, is it possible to translate also poetry and also dialect, not word for word, but for Pasolini, translation is the main proof, he writes in a writing, the evident test of the value of a language and of a dialect converted in language. Not by chance, Pasolini himself published his Friulan poems with the Italian translation at the bottom. You can find the translation not made by the curators of a book, but translation is by Pasolini himself. I want to tell you something about Pasolini at the end of his production. All this, my speech, can explain why, after also the Friulan period of his life, that ends 1949, Pasolini cared always for Italian dialects, considered like islands of expressive and not alienated authenticity. In a writing called Dal Laboratorio, that is from a workshop, 1976, he writes, the chaos, Italian chaos in language is an advantage for Italians. Because that magma of, I translate so, that magma of speeches in competition each other turn our mind in a market of alternative languages and cultures. Therefore, the fact of choosing among all these linguistic possibilities is a mark of freedom and democracy. He used these words. The professor before says the same thing. We can choose in Friulano, in Italiano, in Inglese, Francese, but also the variant in Friulano, the Casarsa, is a possibility, more possibility that one choice or no choice. No? I conclude. Sì, io finisco subito. The progressive, in Pasolini, in opinion of Pasolini, the progressive advancing of a national Italian language and the progressive worst and loss of dialects is a suffering for Pasolini. In fact, which kind of Italian he considered growing? The Italian spoke in television, the Italian of Mike Bongiorno, he writes, or an Italian imposed by new technology and new capitalism. In both cases, a language without power, without soul, only used for basic communication and according with mass ideology of a consumistic society devoid of inner differences. In the last Pasolini's public conference in Lecce, 1975, in October, he was invited in a school, to talk about languages and cultures menaced. The writing is Volgareloquio, the name of his this speech in that occasion. A Volgareloquio is an expression used by Ezra Pound. No? But in that occasion, Pasolini astonished all the people, saying that dialects are, in that period, only survived, were spoken only by children or old men, and so by people out of the active life. And finally, that in his opinion, was unuseful to devise strategies for giving life to a language almost in agony. He said, to survive for a language means almost not to exist. And not by chance, he gave proof of this final despair about modern society and the agony of dialects with a personal return to a Friulan poetry, but now without light and lyrical sound. It's a common knowledge, I think, that you know, that in 1974 he wrote in a second form some poems published in the book, his first book, Return to His Youth. Named in the book is named not La meglio gioventù, but La nuova gioventù, the new youth. In these exercises of a second writing, he, rather than writing, seems cross out. He said, invece di scrivi al cancella, invece di scrivere cancella. The question is, for that Pasolini at the end, a programmatic reversal of himself and his hope, expressed now in a Friulian language that seems kept off and refused. And so, a memoria, I want to, a little bit, to tell you a poem, Pasolini, in the first form and in the second form, the famous Dedica. The first poem in Poesia Casarsa, the first poem in La meglio gioventù, in Friulano. Sounds so, the first form. Fontana di Aga dal me país. A Noè aga pi frescia che tal me país, fontana di rustic amor. That is, spring, no? Spring of water of my village. Doesn't exist water more fresh than in my village. Spring of love, of rustic love. How becomes in the second form this poem? Fontana di aga di un país no me. Noè aga pi vecia che taquel país, fontana di amor par nissun. Translation: spring of water of a village not mine. Giusto mine? There is not water elder than in that village. No more mine village. That is far from him. Third verse, springs of love for nobody. The end of, for him, of the languages, the end, the languages and dialects, the end of his hope is expressed in a Friulian without light, without charm. So, I finished. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe we can clap hands. Thanks, everyone. I know we went beyond time, so thanks for your patience.